Welcome everyone again. My name is Briana Weiner. I know I said hi a little bit ago, but to formally introduce myself, I'm really excited to be here today and to talk with you all over the next 90 minutes or so, not quite 90 minutes, but over an hour, talking about students with autism and how we can support them in the classroom. Gen ed, special ed, it doesn't matter. Hopefully everything I say can be applicable to both settings, right? So just really briefly about myself, I started my career teaching here in the Chicago Public Schools, actually. Anyone from CPS here? No one here in Chicago, and no one's from Chicago Public Schools. So I was a teacher, and I taught students on the autism spectrum, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in a self-contained classroom. Then I had the pleasure of working for the Illinois PBIS network and the Midwest PBIS network, so training schools and supporting coaches in buildings that were implementing PBIS. And currently I work at a special ed co-op as an instructional coach. So again, continuing to support schools and teachers and coaches both on the PBIS side and on the individual student sides, continuing to support students with autism. So that's a little bit about my background. So let's jump to what I'm hoping you'll walk away with today. So our objectives. We'll spend a lot of our time talking about evidence-based practices for students with autism. That'll really be the meat of the presentation. Toward the end, we'll get into more about some strategies, hoping to build your toolboxes so that no matter what your role is, social worker, teacher, we'll get into those roles in a second, but you can go into a classroom and if you're teaching, pull out a strategy that'll work really well for a student. If you're a coach or a social worker, you can suggest ideas and have maybe some new tips and techniques that you can use. And I will leave time at the end, hopefully, based on how we're going, about 5 or 10 minutes for some reflection, action planning, and to complete our session evaluations. So as a presenter, I will start and end on time. I will provide you lots of examples. Please jump in and provide your own examples as well. I'm sure there's tons of knowledge and lots of expertise and experiences in the room. So please jump in with your own ideas. I hope to provide you lots of explanations. If something isn't making sense, please raise your hand and let me know so that I can explain it in a different way. And I'll check for understanding along the way. All I ask of you is that you stay open to new ideas instead of why that won't work with this student or in this classroom. Think about how you can make something work for this student or this classroom. And we are gonna have a few activities, so let's try to stay engaged during that time as well. Any questions? Okay, so as you look over the agenda here for our time together, raise your hand if you're a teacher. All right, keep your hand up if you're a special ed teacher. So a lot of special ed teachers. What about social workers in the room? A couple social, all the way in the back, social workers, come on. Psychologists? Only 1, 2, okay, yes, sorry. And I don't mean to be ignoring you guys here in the front, so I'll try to bounce back and forth. Who am I missing? Administrators? A couple administrators. Who did I miss? What else are you? Anybody I missed? Did I not say a job? Yes.
Behavior specialist.
Behavior specialist, thank you. Yes, in the back. Behavior specialist, okay. So is that more of a consultative role? Okay, go to multiple buildings, coaches, great. What were you gonna say? Speech path, great. And what about like PT, OT, any other itinerant services? Okay, all right, awesome. So let's dive right in. We're gonna start with a really quick turn and talk activity to get everyone thinking and talking. Obviously you're here because the title of this session, or maybe my name, stood out to you. Doubtful it's my name, I'm sure it's the title of the session. And so I just want you to take a minute and think and kind of ground ourselves in where we're gonna be spending the next hour or so. Talk about either what is autism? Start thinking in your head, if you're a teacher, what are the strategies that you're using? What are your go-to evidence-based practices, hopefully, or at least some strategies that you use when you're teaching students with autism? Because I saw a lot of hands go up when I asked for teachers. If you're not a teacher, but you're a social worker, you're a speech path, you're a behavior specialist, what are the strategies that you're seeing people use? What are the practices that teachers are using in their classrooms? So start to take kind of an inventory so that when we get into discussing those practices, you know what you're more fluent with and what you have seen. What's working with those practices? And where do you need some ideas? What's not working so well? So I'm gonna give about 3 or 4 minutes so you can turn and talk, and then we'll share out and keep moving. All right, go ahead. I'm hearing a lull. Means everybody's good, right? You had 40 seconds left, but I'll take my cue from you. Okay, So let's talk about it a little bit. What did you guys discuss when you were together? Can anyone share some practices that they're seeing being used or that they are using? Or maybe how you define autism, what you see, what you think of when you hear autism. Yes, thank you.
Some strategies that I've seen in the classroom are like token economy, schedules, teaching rules and expectations.
Great, so token economy, schedules, teaching those rules and expectations, very PBIS, awesome, thank you. Anybody else?
I might
Yes.
just use Michelle University.
Yes, social thinking.
Yes, her curriculum's really good. She really breaks it down for anybody on how to work with students.
Yes.
Love Social Detective book. It's great for all ages.
Thank you. I saw another hand, did I? See a hand? How about one more? Yes, thank you.
With the student I'm thinking of in particular, a lot of visual cues, and making sure clear expectations and clear rules. He likes to follow rules when they're very clear.
Doesn't sound like someone on the spectrum at all, does it? Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. So, what is autism, right? So I just put some statistics up there, some things to keep in mind, but I think that what we all know, having worked with students on the spectrum, is that students with autism can look very differently, right? So although we know that, 1/3 might remain nonverbal, there are also students that are incredibly verbal and have a lot to say, right? So we always say, if you've seen one student with autism, you've seen one student with autism, because the behaviors they display, it can really vary from student to student, although, many may like trains. There might be some that don't like trains. You never know. So does anyone have working with a student that has a really interesting or funny thing that they're particularly interested in? Yes.
I have a student that is a 7th grader, and he's trying really hard to socially fit in with his friends.
Bless him.
He made some SpongeBob jokes, and it is now involved into him having the nickname Gary, which
Okay.
is great because he now fits in with his friends and makes jokes. But then it is also now a problem that Gary's the one who shouted out and was swearing in class, not him.
Oh, it wasn't me, it was Gary.
Associated. And
Yes.
it's great because he's making friends, and not so great because he's got some inappropriate behavior.
Yes. Well, I'm glad that he's making friends and trying that, and I'm sure you'll come up with a way to help him work through all of that. And we'll talk about that as well. So one thing I always like to remind people is that along with autism, lots of students have other things going on, right? Along with, needing speech and OT and all those services that we see in school, there can be medical ways that the students are impacted as well. So a little list up there, especially with as far as the sleeping and the eating. Anyone dealing with students on the spectrum have some sleeping and eating issues going on? Yeah, I had tons of students that, maybe they had to take a really small dose of some sort of sleeping medication to help them. And, some parents are in favor of that, some parents aren't. So, what's the parent's voice? How do they feel about that? Or sleeping. I worked when I was in college with a student who, all his food was pretty much pureed because of those sensory issues. He really couldn't eat. He had difficulty swallowing. And everything he ate was probably not the way we would like to eat our steak, but that was what he did. So lots of things to think about, okay? Here's a little data here from my state of Illinois. I'm sure that, what other states are here? Shout out where you're from. Michigan. Virginia, California. Iowa? Anyone from Hawaii? Someplace very warm. Ooh, I'm going for Thanksgiving with a 4-year-old and a 5-month-old. Send prayers. So here in Illinois, we've seen such an increase in students on the spectrum, and I'm sure that your states are mimicking this data as well, right? So when we see this data and we see that we've rapidly increased the number of students who are being serviced under the label of autism, there's some challenges that accompany that data and those numbers, right? So let's talk about some of those challenges. Not everyone has the knowledge and fluency of what evidence-based practices to learn. I know that when I went to school, when I was an undergraduate, I never had a class called Evidence-Based Practices for Students with Autism or anything like that. So I felt like when I graduated, I knew use PECs and make visuals, but I didn't really understand using, research-based and evidence-based practices. So I'm gonna throw out there that probably there's a lot of other teachers out there who might be in the same boat that I was in. Also, how to individualize and combine practices. So if you're working with multiple kids on the spectrum, which chances are you might be, how do you service them all and have time to support all of their individual needs and use evidence-based practices, right? Tricky. Taking data. We live in such a data-heavy world with schools and progress monitoring and all of that. What are we taking data on? What's important? What's not important? Create an ongoing plan for systems change, maintenance, and sustainability. So basically what that means is even if students are responding to the interventions, how are we going to maintain that response? How do we make sure it's sustainable? How are we making sure they're generalizing it? Because when I was a teacher and I had my students in my self-contained room, they would do really great 80, 90% of the time. But how could I generalize that? How could I put them out in library or push them in for math or send them to the lunchroom and hope that those skills that we had worked on so hard in my classroom, they were going to generalize all over the building, right? And that's what we want, because unfortunately, there aren't self-contained classrooms for 25-year-olds and 29-year-olds and 35-year-olds. So we want to try to prepare them as best we can for what happens after they leave our rooms, right? And they leave our schools. And lastly, working with families. And that can be a challenge because, like I said earlier, families, and I thought the plenary this morning was amazing because families all have different values and all have different beliefs. And what one family might think is okay, like I mentioned earlier, giving a little bit of medication to help their child sleep through the night, another family might be totally opposed to using any sort of medical intervention, be it for ADHD or sleep issues, things like that. So really trying to honor the parent's voice, the family's voice, while we are supporting the students as well. And that can be a challenge. So we're going to start by addressing that first concern or first hurdle that I mentioned, that evidence-based practices. How many people feel like they are pretty confident that they know about the evidence-based practices for students with autism? Raise your hand if you feel like, I've got the evidence-based practices down. You sit down, Briana. I'll come stand up here and do your presentation. Okay, so I only saw 2 hands. So this is a good sign, right? This is what we're here for, to talk about those practices. So luckily, you don't have to go out and get the Journal of Positive Behavior Supports and read 1,000 different studies and figure it all out yourself, because there have been 2 major reviews done recently that did just that. They looked at all of the research and all of the interventions, and they read all the articles, and they basically summarized it to come up with what are the best practices, the evidence-based practices for students with autism. So we'll start with the National Standards Project. And they actually they did a phase 1 and they just completed phase 2 not that long ago, 2015. And so what they determined was that there were 14 established interventions and 18 emerging. So obviously established had more strong evidence of really working and being effective with students on the spectrum. Emerging meant, it worked, but not quite as strong. So we'd probably always start with those 14 strongest, right? And these are the 11 that were from 2009. So they went from the 11 to the 14. So they found a few more. So I'll just let you look at this list real briefly. Take a look at those 11 established practices. Hold up your hand. How many are you currently implementing, or are you seeing teachers implement? Do you regularly see 1 or 2 of these? See 4 or 5? 0? How about how many of these are you seeing, are you using, are being implemented? 2, 4, 5, 3, 4, 2. Good. 5. Okay. So kind of everywhere from 2 to 5, about half of them, or half or so. So that's a good start. Then we go to the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. And they have 24 focused interventions. So from their review and what they found are 24 focused interventions. So again, take a look. We'll talk a little bit about the overlap between the 2 studies, but here's the short list, so to say. So they also, both studies have gone through a few rounds, but this is the more recent update, and it went to 27 focused interventions. They used broader search terms, they looked at more studies, and they found that 27 interventions would be considered evidence-based practices. So the good news is that there was substantial agreement between the two reviews that were done. 21 of the established practices identified by the NPDC were considered established by NSP. So 21 of them overlapped and were considered highly applicable, established, evidence-based practices. 4 of them were still the emerging ones that we talked about that weren't necessarily harmful, because there were some that they said were like bad, don't use, I don't talk about those, we won't waste our time, but emerging means like borderline, right? 4 of those were emerging, and then only 2 were not identified. So what does that tell us? It means that we've got at least 21 evidence-based practices that we know, studies have shown, have been reviewed by people who spend their time doing this work as being evidence-based practices for students with autism. To take it even further, now this is new because, like I said, these studies might be 3, 4, 5 years old, and I've done a presentation similar to this for at least 4 years, because my daughter's almost 4, and I was about 9.5 months pregnant with her 4 years ago when I did this presentation. She was born about 4 days after the conference. So it's been at least 4 years of me doing a presentation similar to this. And what they didn't have 4 years ago, which I think is a game changer, is Affirm Models. So basically, the NPDC created modules for each of those evidence-based practices. One thing you should know is in my PowerPoint, if you download it, all of the links to everything are in the notes section. So the links to the different reviews and the links to the modules, it's all in the notes section of my presentation. I'm sorry, I should have said that earlier. So you've got these great modules that are super quick. I have not done them all, but most of them range between 1.5 hours to 2 hours. To the longest one I've seen was like 2.5 to 3 hours. So you could take 2-3 hours and dive in and learn one of these practices. So that's a great tool to be able to share with other teachers. You want to know more about the antecedent interventions? Take 2 hours, do these modules, learn about that. So here's a screenshot of what it looks like when you go to their website. They're listed in blue, and let's say you click on self-management, it'll take you to the self-management page. It clearly lays out what you'll learn, and it breaks it down by lessons and how long you'll need to complete the lesson. And they're free, right? We're all teachers, we all love free things. So instead of taking a day off, making sub-plans, leaving your building, driving to a conference, not that I'm hating driving to a conference, so obviously we're all here today for professional development, and that's a great way to learn. But as another option, consider taking a look at these modules. I think they're really helpful, and like I said, they weren't around 3 or 4 years ago, so that's a great addition to the field. Another item or material that I think will really help, and I think maybe I should have introduced it in the other order. I thought about this as I was going over my presentation last night, but this is the Evidence-Based Practices Matrix, and this was put together by a woman by the name of Kathy Gould here in the state of Illinois. She did the same thing. She went through both of the reviews and found all of the practices that overlapped, and she created this matrix. And I like it because it kind of gives you a little description, and I think that some of these key features like the age range. So if you're a teacher working with 4th and 5th graders, go to the matrix, see which of the interventions work for 10, 12-year-olds. So it kind of lets you know where to start. So instead of just diving straight into the online modules, you can look at the matrix, you can make sure, hey, this is appropriate. The data has shown that this works for this age group, right? Because we don't want to waste our time doing interventions and learning all about these practices if it's not going to be applicable to the age of the students that you're particularly working with. So maybe start here, and this is also available online with my materials. It's the handout that's listed there. So download this, take a look, see the age range. When you've decided maybe you're going to use it, look about, when am I going to use it? What is this really going to help me do? Then maybe do the module, learn some more, okay? Any questions about the modules or about this matrix? Good? Okay, we'll keep going then. So now that we know what are the evidence-based practices and we know where to find them and we know how to learn more about them if we're not familiar with all of them, How do we continue to select evidence-based practices? We know they exist. We have to think about two other items, right? I love visuals, like all of our students on the spectrum. I love a good visual. So this one I think really sums it up for me. We've got to also consider our own professional expertise. So what are you as a professional going to feel comfortable implementing in your classroom, or as a coach, as a district personnel? What can you support the teacher in implementing? And we also have to think about the individual characteristics of those students, because like we said in the beginning, they can be so varied. So will this particular practice, we have the research that it works, and I know how to do the practice, but will it work with that particular student? So when all three of those things can combine, that's how we really get to where we should be implementing, what we should start with. A few other items to look at. I know that this isn't as pretty of a visual, but along with the individual characteristics of the student, things like age we mentioned, think about the environment or the setting that the student's in. So an evidence-based practice that you might use in a self-contained classroom would be very different than an evidence-based practice that you might need to use for a student who's in inclusion full-time all day, right? It's gonna look differently. So that's something to consider. What skills need to be taught? What's the capacity to implement? Again, if a student is in inclusion all day, that's great. How is the teacher, the gen ed teacher, going to be supported in implementing these practices? Is there capacity for that? Do they need some training as well? Oftentimes, as special educators, we can get a lot of training in these practices, but a lot of times the gen ed teachers wouldn't have that same training. So how can we make sure that they're going to feel comfortable and confident and feel like they have the tools to really implement these interventions as well in these practices? And lastly, involving the families and students, right? We always want to keep that in the back of our minds. How can we make sure that the students are comfortable with it and that the families are comfortable and the families know? I think that the modules are great things to share with the parents too. Maybe not all of them, but there are some modules that, some of our parents could benefit from learning more about those social stories and things of that nature, and how some little strategies that they might be able to use at home. Now, I know that not all of our parents have access to internet or computers, so it might not always work, but for those of us that work with families that do, we can share the modules with them. I have to say the non-examples too, right? What not to consider when selecting an evidence-based practice, because I've done all of those things, so I can honestly say it's probably not a good idea, but I'll admit that I've done them. So we don't want to just pick a package and go with it without any knowledge of the research behind it, right? Which none of you will do, because you've all seen the studies and seen the research, so we've checked that off. Doing what feels right, not always the best place to start. I think the third one is what I see most frequently, right? So staff go out and they get trained in something, and it's probably a great intervention, but does that mean it's the right intervention for every student, right? And that goes back to one of the challenges for schools, was trying to meet the needs of all the students, right? When we send teachers to training, have we really invested in making sure that that training that they're attending is evidence-based, meets the needs of the students and the families, and is really gonna get at the outcomes that we want for those students? It's gotta be tied back to the outcomes for them, okay? And lastly, the parents are asking. Sometimes parents can feel really strongly about certain interventions being used, and then it's our job as professionals to hear that, to think about that, and to use all of our professional resources to know whether or not that is a good intervention, or to help the parents to understand why that may or may not be the best intervention for the student. So I had a parent when I was teaching that really felt really strongly that going to Mexico and swimming with the dolphins would really cure their son's autism. I didn't personally feel that way, but I had to hear them, and that was what they wanted to do on their free time and on their vacation and use of their money, and so that was what they chose to do. But did I tell them that I thought that was going to cure their son's autism? No, and I could only provide them with as much research and as much support and guide them and kind of let them make that decision on their own then, right? Okay. So let's apply these evidence-based practices to the framework, right? The triangle. Now, I didn't put a triangle in my slide. Don't tell George Sugai or Dr. Rob Horner, don't tell them there wasn't a triangle. They might kick me out. But let's think about it. I always hear Dr. Sugai say that PBIS is a framework, right? It's a framework. You fit your interventions within the framework. So let's think about the evidence-based practices and how they fit within a framework as well, right? So in the triangle, we've got green, yellow, red. We've got what we do for all students, what we do for some students, and what we do for just a few students. It should be the same thinking and the same processing when you're selecting evidence-based practices to fit within a framework for students on the spectrum. All students with autism are going to need some kind of support. Even if it's just a daily check-in, even if it's just a peer buddy that they have lunch with, you know, all students with autism will need something. And then you've got some students with autism who are gonna need a lot of somethings, right? Those are the ones we always think of who are gonna need a whole handful of interventions to make it through their day and to help them to be successful and to keep them on track and calm and all those things. So when you're selecting those evidence-based practices, think about that. We want to get as much bang for our buck, so to say. So I've heard Dr. Sugai say to schools, when you're selecting evidence-based practices, select the interventions that are going to work the best for your school. Same thing for students with autism. Try to select the interventions that will give you the most bang for your buck, that will meet the needs of your students on the spectrum, but also taking into account those things we said, their age, the setting, the characteristics, and all of that. But we want to make sure that we're considering what we need to do for all students, for some students, and then for just a few students as well. Okay? So we're going to pause and we're going to have time to do another activity because I want you to really I know what it's like to go to a conference and then you have a long weekend. Does everyone have Monday off? No? Oh, wow, sorry. We don't have Monday off here, but I know what it's like to go to a conference and hear good things. Hopefully you're liking what you're hearing, but then you dive back into your classroom on Monday and you have to play catch up from being here for the last 2 days and fly to Hawaii and you have a horrible jet lag. So I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes now. I want you to take a minute and either look at the matrix or look at the modules and just take a look and get familiar with it. Maybe jot down a place that you wanna start when you get back and what practices are you already familiar with? Or what do you want to kind of dive in and look at on Monday when you're back in your building? So I'll give you about 5 minutes to do that, and then we will keep rolling. Okay? Okay, if I can pull you back together, please. We're going to keep rolling. We're already halfway through, if you can believe that. Thank you. I hate to do that because I know there were a lot of good conversations. Who can share something they saw, something they discussed, something they're excited about doing when they get back? Thanks.
I've actually done some of the Affirm modules within my coursework in grad school, and I found them to be very helpful and very user-friendly.
Awesome.
Cut out all the jargon that behavior analysts use. So I found like the antecedent interventions and consequence interventions to be very beneficial.
Testimony to the Affirm modules. Thank you. I didn't plant her. She's not being paid. Other things, so checking out those modules. Did you?
I'll jump in. We were talking a lot about extinction.
Yes.
And I was saying that it's like a real simple intervention, but when I was doing ABA therapy, like one-on-one with the kids, that was one of the biggest things that we used to distinguish behavior. So that I was just telling them a little bit about some of my experiences and having to keep a poker face when being bit or something like that, but not wanting to give any attention or even say ow or show a facial expression, which can reinforce the behavior.
I think some people can do it really well, right? And I think there are some people that just can't. And like that's knowing yourself and knowing your strengths. And I worked with a classroom paraprofessional and she would not be very good at, not showing her emotions and how she felt. I could ignore temper tantrums so well that my student once thought I fell asleep. And she was temper tantrum and screaming and jumping, and I had cleared the room, and I was just sitting at my desk, sitting there, not really paying attention, ignoring her, and she came over and said, "Wake up!" I was like, well, obviously I'm doing my job of ignoring you. If you think I've fallen asleep, I have not. But yeah, so you have to know, because the first thing we know about extinction is that, if you respond, you kind of undo everything you just did, right? So you have to really commit to it. Pretend you've fallen asleep and your students will stop having a temper tantrum. Anything else to share? Yes.
I think from a district perspective,
that each school kind of has to pull their teams together, and that maybe one member from each grade level to really assess their needs. For what evidence-based practice do we need to use for our students this year? Because every year your population changes. And needs
Absolutely.
change. And that way you're not overwhelming your general ed staff with all these different strategies.
Right.
You need to pick something that will work for each
Yes.
grade level.
That's a
That will be
great point.
effective to save time like we had spoken
Right.
about. Yeah.
So don't go back and email everyone the link to all the Affirm modules. Pick the one that's going to help the most and send the teachers that one Affirm module. Because if you send them all, they're going to not want to do any because they'll feel overwhelmed, right? Naturally, as anyone would feel overwhelmed with all of them out there. Great point. Thank you. Okay. So we are going to move a little bit away from the evidence-based practices if everyone feels good and confident and know what they're going to do moving forward. Can I get a thumbs up if we are good to move on to kind of our next section? Awesome. Thank you. So now we're going to talk more about those strategies, like I said, trying to really build up what tools you have in your toolbox. What can you go to when you need to? So there's 4 things that I'm kind of always keeping in the back of my mind when I visit classrooms and I'm trying to support students and support teachers. So what are the 4 things that students with autism need, right? Clarity. They like to have that, like we said, the clear plan, to know what's going to happen, to know the expectations and procedures. Consistency, having everyone on the same page. Kind of ties back to clarity, right? So that they know if they're with this teacher or this teacher, they're going to receive consistent feedback. The behaviors in one classroom are going to receive the same response as if they do the behaviors in another classroom. And that can be challenging, right? Middle schools, high schools, where they see multiple teachers a day, trying to get all the teachers to respond to the students in the same or a pretty similar way can be a challenge. Simplicity, trying to make things as simple and practical as possible, right? So taking away the bells and whistles and really just stripping it down to what the students need. And continuation, like we said earlier, even when the behavior improves, when they've made progress, when they've mastered a skill, how can we leave things in place to keep them supported, but also how do we pull back at the same time, right? It's like you want to fade, but you don't want to fade so much that they regress. So it's that balancing act, and it can be really tricky. So I always think in my head, clarity, consistency, simplicity, continuation. I can't come up with a good acronym, CCSC, but in my head I also always think like PBIS, right? PBIS does all these things. It makes everything more clear and consistent. It's pretty simple to implement, right? I mean, there are lots of pieces that go into it all, but the ideas behind it, the foundation, the framework, that's simple. And you don't take PBIS away. You don't stop teaching the expectations just because referrals are down this month. So we're not going to say, be safe, be respectful, be responsible, because the kids got it. Referrals are down. No. We keep teaching the expectations and we keep reinforcing the expectations in the same way. So what I really like about the things that support students with autism, those are the same things that all the buildings that are implementing PBIS are working towards doing and working towards putting into practice. So they're very tied together. So here's an example. And so think about those in your head, the clarity, the consistency, the simplicity. Something like this. So you see your school expectations, be respectful, be responsible, be safe. This is in the hallway. So this is just a really quick example of how you can modify those expectations for the school to support students on the spectrum, right? Just by providing a visual like we've talked about. Is it clear what the student should do? Is it consistent? If we hung that in every hallway, would they know what they need to do in every hallway? Right? Is it simple? Is it something that you can keep using over and over? Maybe you don't have to walk up to the sign and point to it, or before I would take my class in the hallway, I would always review the expectations. We're gonna walk in the hallway, we're gonna stay quiet, and maybe it gets to the point in the year where you don't need to say all that before you leave the classroom. Maybe you just give a visual and point at it. Or maybe it's to the point where you don't need to do that, but it's always there. We don't take the signs down just because the kids have gotten better at walking in the hallway, right? So common strategies. Along with all those things that I said to keep in mind, the clarity and the consistency, you could Google autism, visuals for autism, and this is exactly what comes up. I took a screenshot of it. So there's thousands of visuals, and I'm sure if you're like me when I was teaching, you do that because you don't want to take the time to make the visual. Like, someone has clearly made a visual for keeping your hands to yourself on the bus. I should not have to do that, right? So we're trying to find the things that work for our students. But another thing that I've heard Dr. Sugai say is that you can't just make the visuals and put them up and hope that the students will display the expected behaviors, right? What do we have to do? We have to teach it over and over again, and we have to reinforce it. So there's lots of common strategies out there. There's lots of visuals. There's lots of things you can find. You know about the evidence-based practices, but unless you teach it to the students, you're not going to have the impact that you're hoping to have. So the first thing that I think of when I'm trying to support students with autism is, how can I adapt the environment? What can I change to the environment to better support those students? So it really has nothing to do with what I'm going to do with the student. So whereas the evidence-based practices might have more direct relation to working one-on-one or individually or in a group with the students, this is more just strictly about the environment. So how can I organize and provide structure? So like the example we just saw, that visual for the hallway. What other structures can I provide? Is it tape on the floor? Is it dividing the room? What can I do to the routines of our day to help the students be more successful? Can anyone give me an example of something they've done for this? Or something they've seen? Yes, thank you.
Little guy would just have electrical tape to help divide the space.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not touching anything around it, and just a visual of the form basically.
Perfect. So taped off his area and provided a visual of hands to self, stuff like that. Yeah. Quiet voice. And I saw another hand over here. Yeah.
I've used little personalized schedules, and the kids that are pushed out for gen ed most of the day
Mm-hmm.
make like a special schedule that just small they put on their desk and they cross off what they're doing.
Great.
And depending on how much broken down they need, some of them just have just the general sections, and some of them have like within guided reading the whole hour.
Mm-hmm.
They have it broken down each section and usually looking through.
I love that. So a little schedule, and for students that just need the general schedule, or for students that need it more broken down, more chunked out, we can differentiate in that way. Thank you. So another way to adapt the environment is to really think about those transitions, right? We all know transitions can be a difficult time for children, adults, and children on the spectrum. So we need to do what we can to help inform those transitions, to support the students through them. Those visual supports that we've talked about. And I will be the first to say that I am not an expert on the tech-savvy side of the visuals, like using the iPads. I know that there are lots of apps out there, but that is not my area of expertise because, again, I taught in the Chicago Public Schools. I didn't get handed an iPad, like, good one. So I didn't use iPads, and I never got tech-savvy because I wasn't working in a district that had those resources available. So I think it's great if you are in a district that has those resources and you can use the tech, but it's not needed. You know, I just made everything with paper and pencil. And who here has used contact paper instead of lamination? I see, I feel you. I've got you. So you don't have lamination, your school can't laminate, you just buy contact paper at the grocery store and just like cover it like that. It works. So create a safe space. I think this is one of the things that I always try to teach teachers when I go into their classrooms, and the kids are, so when I go into classrooms now, it's because the students are really struggling and I'm called in to support the students and teachers. And so I always want to make sure that there is a safe space, that there is a break area, that there's a quiet area, whatever you want to call it, depending on like the age, and you know, like a safe space. Middle school kids might laugh about that name, so call it like the cool corner or something. Let them name it. I'm not cool, but they'll come up with a good name for it. And make sure you have that space for them, because that's really important, that they know that there's a place that they can go to calm down. But again, just putting that place in your classroom and like hoping the kids will just go there and calm themselves down, I'm not confident that that'll happen. What do we have to do if we want them to go there? Teach them to use it, right? Teach them to go there. So you might do a lot of self-talk, and you might say like, I'm feeling really angry today, so I'm gonna go and sit down over here, and I'm gonna take 5 deep breaths, and then we're all gonna role play how we're gonna calm down when we get worked up. And I think if you're a person that's gonna feel really cheesy doing that, maybe practice it at home with the person you're living with or your own kids to get really used to talking out loud and talking through things and practicing, because those are the skills that the students on the spectrum need to hear us and see us doing and normalizing it. And lastly, I lied, reduce stimuli. So thinking about the lighting in rooms. How many of you have, students that either wear headphones or that you've done some sort of alternate lighting so that they're less distracted or it's more pleasing and easier for them to focus. So think about that for the environment. And lastly, really, consider the staff assignments. So like I said earlier, some staff could do extinction and some might not be able to. Some teachers or staff members are going to be really great with academic skills and teaching those one-on-one academic skills and math and reading. I always hated teaching reading. I am not a reading teacher. People go to get their reading specialist degrees. That's not me, but I'll teach you social skills all day long and I'll role play and act silly because I don't care. So, think about what you're good at and what the staff you're working with are good at and trying to pair them up so that you're utilizing their strengths so that you're not making it harder for yourself, right? And again, all of these things are preventative. These are all things that we set up in advance. What does that remind you of? PBIS, right? So just like being preventative with PBIS, all the things that we're setting up and changes in the environment to support students on the spectrum should be preventative as well. So I've got a couple examples because I know we all love examples, right? So just like the hallway one, here's the one for the coat room. Again, maybe you have lockers, so this might not be applicable, but you could put it by your lockers. Here's a morning checklist, right? So this is kind of when we were talking about those transitions, how to get students in the building or from once they walk in the building into, getting working, hanging up their coat, put away your backpack. You can put it in a page protector and they can check it off every day and reuse it over and over and over again, right? It's their morning routine. You can make one for their afternoon routine or for any routine. Here's one that sounds similar to kind of what you were mentioning, your seat work or your assignments for those academic skills. What are you going to do when you're at your seat? You stay on task, you finish your work, stay in your seat until you have permission. Notice that there's words and pictures, right? So this is probably for a student that has some reading skills, whereas this one, maybe not as much or less reading skills. This one you really don't need any reading skills for, right? So we can vary the words and the pictures based on the skill level for reading of the students, the age of the students. Okay, so that was all about changing the environment, setting things up, being preventative. The next big thing to consider is teaching replacement skills. Now, I could stand up here for another hour and talk all about FBA and replacement skills, but we only have about 20 minutes left, so I won't get into it, but I will tell you that in the next breakout session, there are 2 breakouts all about function and behavior. So that's E12 and E14. So I don't have time to get into function and how to determine the function and the behavior, but there's 2 sessions coming up right after this about function. So if that's something that you feel like is an area where you could gain some more professional information and some professional growth in, I encourage you to go to those 2 sessions because, again, I'd love to talk about it, but I don't have time. So the broad strokes about function and replacement skills are, I know I'm sounding like a bit of a broken record at this point, but that we have to teach them, right? We can't just assume that the students know what to do. We have to explicitly teach those replacement skills. Teach them something else to do, something that's better. So instead of hitting the person next to them to get your attention, how can they appropriately get your attention? Instead of running out of the classroom, what's something else that they can do that's more appropriate? So we have to teach those skills, and it has to meet the function. After we've taught them and we've modeled them and we've role played and we've done all that, we have to make sure that we're reinforcing them as well. So in the same way that you teach those expectations at the beginning of the year to all the students, the safe, responsible, respectful, and you model it and you do that, it's the same thing. It's just on a really individual, small level. And there might be a case, or probably no harm to a lot of a lot of extent to teach, these replacement skills to the whole class, because a lot of times, a lot of the social skills one student's struggling with, other students in the classroom might struggle with. But there also might be times where it's a replacement skill that's really specific to one student and that one student's behavior, and you're really just going to be teaching it to the one individual student. So it varies. But then you're reinforcing it. My last point regarding replacement skills is just making sure that you know what motivates the students. So I put up there the forced choice reinforcement menu. You can Google it and download it, or any reinforcement menu. That one's a little bit longer, but I think it does a really good job of getting at, giving kids lots of options and really getting at what reinforces them. Because sometimes we think we know, but you can do that to really confirm and make sure that this is the strongest way to motivate the students. So anyone else have another tool they use to get at motivators for students? Any? Okay. So Google forced choice reinforcement menu. It's like 40 questions, and it gives them 2 choices. Like, do you want a bag of chips or time alone? And they select. Do you want an A on your paper or free time with a peer? So it goes through all these options. Select, 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 select. And then by the end of the 40 questions, it gives you what's the strongest. Are they most reinforced by adult attention, by peer attention, by tangibles or consumables? So it gives like a lot of food as options. Or are they most reinforced by like alone time, free time, that freedom type of thing? Okay. So I'm going to get into the last point as we're coming to a close. We got about 15 minutes left. Generalization can't be assumed, right? So students with autism often have trouble generalizing, applying things from one setting to another. So those are supposed to be does not equal signs. It didn't work out with the PowerPoint. But what's this item on the left? What do you see? A tree. What about that? Tree. So we can tell that these are both trees, but they look different, right? Students with autism might not be able to make that generalization that these are both trees. What about when your teacher, every day your teacher says, it's time for PE, line up for PE. Then you have a substitute teacher and they say it's time for what? I'm not lining up to go to gym. I don't know what that is. Meltdown, right? So we've got to think about these things and again, try to be preventative to try to keep things as consistent as possible for our students. A new room equals a new activity. Different font even. Has anyone had kids that are really particular about the fonts? It's interesting, right? That how that can really throw them off when things are changed. So, all right. So we've talked about how we can adapt the environment, how we can teach replacement skills, and the third thing, which can't be left out, it's obviously very important, is those social skills, right? So we know that our students on the spectrum often lack social skills or struggle with social skills, struggle with the social interactions. Was it you that was saying that the student had made friends, really wanted to make friends, but then all the challenges that came along with that, right? So here's just a few lists of a few different curriculums. Don't have to use any of those. These are just the ones that I see being used most frequently. But what we really want to focus on is how we're going to explicitly teach those skills in the same way that we would teach academic skills. So thinking about self-regulation or sensory, right? Teaching students those skills that they need to calm down and de-escalate as well. So here's an example of a self-management plan. This is this particularly for a middle school student, but could use maybe younger, maybe older, depending again on the reading skills. So the behaviors I exhibit when you're feeling everything from really agitated, little agitated, or calm, right? And I like this because it tells them specifically what they can do. So when I'm calm, this is how I'm feeling, and I'm earning my points. I'm on track. I'm doing the right things. When I'm starting to feel tense and I might bite my tongue or tap my fingers, I look sad, happy, whatever that might be, I need to ask for help. I need to ask to take a break. What are those things that I can do? Now this is where it gets tricky because a lot of times when students are this escalated to where they're crying or yelling or physically acting out, It's really hard to teach them to do those things, right? And we know that we can't teach them anything in the moment. So when they're already there, they're at 10, they've hit you, they've kicked you, that's not when you're saying, remember to sit and take a deep breath, let me pull out this nice visual I made. No. You have to teach them and use the visual the day before the meltdown or the hour before they kick you. And maybe when they get there, you can have it there and you can point to it, but we're not doing a lot of talking and teaching then in that moment. All that teaching has to take place beforehand. So that could be a self-management. And obviously, these are going to look different. The behaviors they exhibit are going to change, and the things that you want them to do are going to change. But this is just an example. I love this one for our younger kids, or maybe our kids that don't have as many of the reading skills. And this is something I mentioned earlier, that quiet area, that think area, calm down space that you could just have sitting there in a stack. And when they go there, they circle. How are they feeling? And then if someone comes and checks in with them, we're walking through this with them. How do you feel? What did you do? What could you do next time? Just a really brief reflection on their behavior. Okay, a few more examples. How many have seen this? Stress thermometers, yes, I love these. So you could fill these out. I think it's great to even have every student in your class do it. If you have a self-contained classroom for kids with autism, have them all do it. Are they able to identify what are their stress signals? Is it days when there's a substitute? Is it going to lunch? Is it math, which is probably going to happen every day? Going to lunch is going to happen every day, right? But a lot of times for our kiddos, those are their triggers. It's like a specific academic task can be really challenging for them. So helping them to begin to identify those feelings and begin to learn how they feel when they're in that agitated state is going to be so helpful for them for the rest of their lives, right? To be able to know how they feel and understand, oh, I'm starting to get anxious. I'm starting to feel nervous or angry or frustrated. And to pair that with those relaxation techniques on the other side. So when you're starting to get nervous about going to math class, what can you do? Go get a drink of water. Say hello to the teacher next door, or your favorite teacher. So that's the stress thermometer. Who's seen the incredible 5-point scale? There's a whole book of visuals that are similar to this. Do you guys use that a lot? I like this one a lot as well. Like I said, I have a daughter who's almost 4. She'll be 4 in a few weeks, and I was practicing my presentation, and she was sitting next to me, and I was trying to teach her all of these. I was like, we need to work on this at home, actually, honey, A 1 is no talking. And I think I said I just had another baby a few months ago. And so there's a lot of times when I'm needing her to be at a 1 or a 2 so that you don't wake your baby sister up. So we've got to go through all those practices and the modeling. When is it a 1? When is it a 2? And when is it okay to be at a 4 or a 5? So helping them to understand that. And this is just I would call it almost like a mini social story. It's definitely not as long. It doesn't have all the components of the social story, but it gives them just a really brief, how do I calm down? What can I do? You could make something like this even into a checklist, or for your students that like to cross things out when they do it, kind of keep them more engaged in it. So how do I calm down? Squeeze my hands. Take 3 breaths. Close my eyes. Think happy thoughts. I would probably recommend being a little more explicit. Think about, what do you know is something that makes them happy? And again, these are all strategies that would work in special ed or in gen ed, all of the things. I think these are great things that even students not on the autism spectrum could benefit from learning some of these calm down strategies, some of these, what do I do when I feel escalated? What do I do when I'm nervous? Because students on the spectrum aren't the only ones who are anxious throughout the school day, right? And one last think sheet or calm down sheet, whatever you want to call it. This particularly was for a first grade classroom. So how do I feel? Well, what did they do? I love it because it really ties back to those school-wide expectations. So, I could have kept my hands to myself. I could have shared the toy with my friends. I'm thinking of first grade examples right now, obviously, but they've taken it one step further. Not only could you have shared, but that's how you show that you're being respectful. Not only should you not have kicked the chair over, but you should have kept our classroom safe. So linking it back to those expectations. And, should I apologize, yes or no? Okay. So like I said, I wanted to build in about 5 more minutes, and I think we have time for it. We do. To let you reflect on those last 3 things we went over: how we can adapt the environment, how we can teach replacement skills, and how we can teach social skills to our students on the spectrum. Think about what's something new you heard today, how you can implement one or hopefully many of the strategies, and if there's any other questions. So I'm going to give you just 3 minutes, and then we'll come back together briefly and share out, and we will wrap up, okay? 3 minutes, go ahead. Okay, everyone's ready to move, right? Okay, so share with me something you heard today that's new that you'll learn, a new strategy. What'd you guys talk about? Yes.
I used to use the zones of regulation, and I had the kids, I was saying like they'd have a little strip of the colors on their desk, and it's first and second grade, so they'd have their picture, and when they come in right away in the morning, we'd say, how are you feeling right now? It would also help us to know how much to put on them before we started.
That's
So
great.
if they were in like the red zones, we had a sensory room and a motor room, so they would go to the sensory room and be super calm and quiet, and the kids that came in really low and like yellow would go to the motor room to wake up, and then if they were ready to learn, they had like task boxes or something to keep them busy until everyone was ready. That's what we did in the morning.
I love that. So it's similar to, check in, check out as PBIS would teach it, but it's got the visual component, and then it follows up with, well, based on how you're feeling when you check in, here's option A, option B, option C.
Yeah, and they had their own little individualized like cards that's right like next to it, and they
Great.
could pick what they wanted to do in the morning, or in the sense that if they just needed a break, they just had like we had a little calm area in the room, and we just could kind of let them pick, and nobody talked or said anything, just here,
Great. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Yes.
We also use the zone of regulation in our school. And
Yes. Zones are huge. Everyone's using them. Yeah.
sometimes my students will identify what zone they're in on their own. Say, Miss Shaw, I'm in the yellow zone. Can I go do this? I can call myself the other times they go straight. It seems from green zone to red zone, and I didn't see what happened, and then I have to call for help. But it does help sometimes whenever they are able to recognize where they are and ask for help before they get to
Yes.
escalation.
Right. And that can take a long time to teach, right? How about one more? One more share out. Yes.
So I work with students with traumatic brain injuries.
Oh, okay.
And I was sharing that the overlap is huge, and the strategies are often quite similar. And I really liked when you showed us my self-management plan, and automatically started ticking off in my head a couple of students that I think
Benefit from it.
would really benefit from that.
Great.
Just kind of having that in your back pocket.
Okay.
I think that I'm really going to explore that more with a couple of my students. I think it'll be really good for them.
Okay, great. So we have a few minutes left where you can wrap up taking notes and action planning and what you're going to do. Please, please, please complete the session evaluation. There are some links to the practices or links to some of the resources, provide feedback, so you can scan this QR code. You can use the app on your phone, but please do that. We have 2 minutes officially left, and then you have 15 minutes to get to your next section. Remember, there are 2 sessions that are going to talk about function. If you want to hear more about that, those would be good to check out. But I will stick around for questions. I appreciate your attention and your participation. I think it went really well, and I learned a lot from you, and hope you got some things out of it as well. So thank you so much. Have a great day.